Hi everyone, welcome to the first video. Today I'd like to explain why and how we need to have conversations about race and racism. These are the two questions that I've been hearing most frequently over the past few weeks, and so I thought that this would be a really good topic to start with. I hope that maybe you've already been able to start having these conversations with the people around you, but if you haven't, or if you've experienced some difficulty in doing so, I hope that maybe this video will be helpful. I also believe that as we start to return to our normal lives, we will be encountering more situations in which having this conversation will be necessary. So let's start with the why. Why do we as white people need to talk about race if it's something that doesn't affect us on a daily basis? Many of us feel like we don't need to talk about racism because we are immune to it. We've watched the civil rights movement videos, we've heard the I Have a Dream speech, we have black friends, we see black people on TV, and we've had a black president. Therefore, the issue must be solved. However, all of us still hold on to ideas that are passively racist, and while it might not affect us on a daily basis, there are things we do to contribute to racism in this country every day without even knowing it. The reason we need to have conversations about racism is so that we understand how our everyday actions contribute to the racism in this country and how we can do a better job of changing them. I think the two most important things to remember when we start to examine the question of why are that A, race is a social construct, not a biological one, and B, every other racial group has to have the conversation about race. Biologically, there isn't any difference between races. While other animals have subspecies, this term cannot be accurately applied to humans. The idea of grouping people together because they look similar externally has nothing to do with the genetic makeup or the biological makeup of humans. Therefore, we are responsible for the social construct of race. Social constructs are perceptions and ideas that are then applied to certain groups or individuals. So because we as a society made race up, we now need to take the responsibility to examine its actual meaning and how it affects the people of each racial group. Every other racial group in our society talks about race. They face some sort of racism every single day. It's something that affects them in a negative way socially. So if every other group has to have this conversation, why haven't we also developed this conversation over time? Well, the construct of race benefits white people in a positive way socially, and for the most part, we aren't even aware of how much it benefits us. If you're anything like me and grew up in a primarily white education system and community, you can agree that we have always been taught to be the best, or to be better, work harder, be smarter than everyone else. It's this intrinsic mentality that has led us away from having these conversations. If something doesn't directly apply to our everyday lives, we tend to ignore it, and for most of us, race is one of those things. But what happens when we do talk about it? First of all, we start to examine more than just our own lives. We start to see our communities and our world as a whole. We begin to have empathy for other people's lives, and while we might not be able to relate or fully understand, we can acknowledge someone else's struggle. Also, because this construct benefits us positively, we have the ability to help make changes. We have a social advantage or privilege, and if we use this to help Black people and other minorities, it can make a huge difference in the time it takes to see progress and the amount of progress that can happen. That being said, our purpose is not to spearhead this progress, but rather use our privilege when needed, after we listen to those at the heart of these movements. Finally, the more we talk about race and racism, the more we normalize having this conversation. While normalizing it doesn't necessarily make the conversation any easier, it becomes something that we're all a little bit more educated about and open to talking about. Now that we know a little bit more about why, let's move on to how do we talk about race and racism. Talking about race and racism is something that is really hard for white people to do, myself included. I think most of us learned that talking about race was really controversial. The bond between race and politics is strong in our society, and this is another subject that we as white people have been encouraged not to talk about. We especially don't want to talk about race with our friends or family or in other places we feel safe. As humans, we need safe spaces, but often with safety and comfort comes complacency. We either feel we don't need to talk about race in these spaces because everyone already agrees with us, or we don't want to ruin these safe spaces with these conversations. In reality, however, these spaces are already really good environments to have these conversations. These people love and respect you and your opinion, and hopefully you respect theirs as well. Starting to have these conversations with those closest to you might seem like a really small thing, but eventually it will build if everyone starts to do the same. Another reason we don't want to have these conversations is because we are intimidated by language. So let's first talk about what words to use when we have these conversations. The first group of words I'd like to talk about are the words Black, African American, and POC, or people of color. As white people, we came to believe that the word Black was a bad word or that it was offensive to the Black community, and therefore we would use the term African American or person of color. We tended to use these terms interchangeably, however, they are not to be used in this way. Again, this is something that I thought up until a few years ago. The term Black is defined as of any human group having dark-colored skin, especially of African, Australian, or Oceanic descent. The term African American is defined as an ethnic group of Americans with total or partial ancestry from any of the Black racial groups of Africa. This term also refers to descendants of enslaved Black people in the United States. Finally, the term POC, or people of color, is defined as not white or of European descent. So you can see how these terms differ from one another and aren't exactly interchangeable. The movement that we're currently in the midst of is called Black Lives Matter because it is a movement of specifically Black people protesting the specific oppression that they have faced in the United States. Yes, some of them are African American and all of them are people of color, but it is important to use the term Black when speaking about this movement. It is also important to note that all people of color experience racism. However, this movement is specifically talking about the racism experienced by Black people. If you're having a conversation with someone and they start to use a term other than Black, you can inform them that this is not a bad word, and in fact it is the correct term to use when speaking about this movement. The next word I would like to talk about is the word racist. I think we as a society have come to define this word as someone who actively seeks to harm Black or brown people. Now, the actual definition of this word is a person who believes in racism, which is the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. This definition is actually in the process of being changed, thanks to the persistent work of 22-year-old Kennedy Mitchum, who is a female Black activist and recent college graduate. The definition will now reflect the social and institutional constructs that have granted advantages based on skin color. So when we start a conversation about racism, it's normally because we hear someone say something that we know or interpret to be racist, or we're trying to address behaviors that we know someone has exhibited in the past. If we start this conversation by saying, "You can't say that, that's racist," or "You're a racist if you believe that," we immediately put the opposite party in a defensive position. I highly doubt that anyone you're going to have a discussion with thinks that they're a racist. They most likely think of this word on society's terms, and they don't think of themselves as someone who actively seeks to harm Black people. They also probably don't fully believe that one race is superior. While it's important for you to note that what they said or did was racist, I encourage you to avoid using the actual word racist in your opening statement. Instead, I would suggest asking them a question. You could say, "Why did you say that?" Or, "What makes you think that?" This way, you not only open the door for more of a conversation, but you don't immediately put them in a defensive position. Their answer to your question can then determine where the conversation goes. If they give an "I don't know" or a "that's just the way it is" answer, chances are they haven't really given this issue a lot of thought, and you can provide them with information which they might be completely open to receiving. If they give a more specific answer, I would encourage you to take the time to listen to their thoughts and to figure out where those opinions could have come from. There are at least two sides to every story, and while one side may be blatantly wrong, there's still an experience behind it. In the description of this video, I will post some examples of what to say to more specific statements that you might encounter. The most important thing to remember when you start having conversations about race and racism is that it's going to take a long time, not just a few days or weeks or even months. While this can be a difficult conversation to have, there's never going to be a convenient time to start. Right now, we're starting the summer season, which is normally one of celebration and relaxation, no cares and few responsibilities. You may be wondering why this has to happen right now when we're in this time. However, the conversation is never going to get any easier to start. I'm not saying you must dedicate your entire life to this topic or give up your summer, but we're in the midst of a movement with momentum, and that momentum can go one of two ways. If we spend a bit of our days with the subject and spend a bit of time talking to those around us, we can continue building the momentum in the right direction. Finally, don't get discouraged if your conversation goes downhill fast the first time, or if it causes tension or frustration. The feeling underneath these conversations is uncomfortable, and it's going to take some time to get used to that feeling. Many of us are very passionate about this topic, and therefore it's easy to get frustrated and even angry when we hear racist statements. While you're waiting to make progress with your conversations, remember that there are always more things that you can do to help the Black Lives Matter movement. These things can be from signing petitions to donating and reading and sharing articles on social media. These are the things that are actually contributing to change right now, so don't feel discouraged if your conversational efforts aren't successful right away. Thank you for watching. If you have any specific questions about how to talk about race and racism, please let me know. I will also be posting some what to say when resources in the description of this video. Next week, we're going to talk about the history of the Black Lives Matter movement. But in the meantime, if you have any topics you would like to see a video about, please let me know. I've also recently updated my Google Docs list of resources, so please revisit that. There are a bunch of new petitions, articles, family resources, and short videos that you can use for your own research. Thank you, stay strong, see you next week.